Most anglers default to the biggest, strongest hook they can get away with. Sounds smart, right? But the hook you're using, the one you think is helping you land more fish, might actually be the reason you're losing your best ones. It's not just about hooking fish. The real difference is what happens after. By the end of this video, you'll know how to select the right hook and land more of the ones that matter.
So it's been a flood year. You can probably see over my shoulder, flipping a bunch of heavy cover. And there's two factors with hooks that I think make a huge difference, whether you hook up with the fish, whether you keep them on, and whether you can get them out of the cover, get them back. One of the concepts, some people understand it. When I used to take a lot of guide customers, some people got that and kind of were onto it. But there's a second factor that makes a huge difference that I rarely talk to anyone who is really onto that, even a lot of the pros. So let me talk to you a little bit about hooks, how you can pick the best one to make sure you're hooking more fish and then keeping them on and then get them out of the cover. Now I'm going to put in a couple minutes of footage here. I was flipping a whole bunch of flooded bushes. You can see what I'm talking about, bringing fish out of cover. But this also applies not only to fish in heavy cover, but like lily pads, or when you're trying to fight a fish in and there's one lay down tree or there's one dock post or something, and that fish always seems to wrap up in it, right? It gets tangled up and you lose them. So I think it applies. If you want to get right into the hook discussion, fast forward through the catching part for a few minutes and then we'll get into the hooks. Time to flip and find out. Got the old General on, light Texas rig. We'll pitch this around and see what happens. See a yo-yo. Oh, lost the General. Another dinky spot. Dang it. Getting those bushes, I don't know if you saw that, but sitting there and just yo-yo it over a limb. You have to decide on the bushes. Sometimes they spawn, if the water's deep enough, the bush gets real wide and then it gets narrowed down at the base. So they'll, if the water's high enough, they get down underneath it and spawn in that clear opening underneath. If the water's low, a lot of times they spawn out in front of the bush. So what I'm doing right now is throwing it kind of up onto the top of the bush, like I'm kind of snagged up in the, or just yo-yoing it over those limbs and then drop it down in the heart of the bush. When it's shallower, I try to skip it up underneath or put it right out in front, like pitch it up to the bush and work it out. Well, got a largemouth that time, but it's a skinny male. They obviously been up here a while. Getting all those males, I tried punching those mats a little more and trying to frog, no bites on that. That General falls so fast, it gets down to the bottom, which is good. This is deceptively deep here on the banks, but going to a creature hog with that lightweight falls a little more slowly. I'm seeing a lot of small bluegill up shallow. I've seen a couple bass chasing around. I don't know if they're raiding nests or if they're fish just up there feeding, but that creature hog gives a little bit more of a bluegill look. See if they want that instead. Some a little bulkier, falls a little bit slower, more gliding instead of that General just whoop. Oh, one bluegill eater. Guess what? Another spawned out male. Finally. That's a spawned out one too. It's a little better. So I think it helps to understand where we're at with hooks now in our baits based a little bit on where we came from. And going back 20, 30 years, you have to remember all we had was monofilament fishing line. It was really stretchy. It was hard to get a hook in fish. And we used a lot of smaller hooks. I mean, this is a straight shank, just a little bitty one. A lot of our worm fishing stuff, we use just straight shank hooks. And this one I've actually tied my own keeper on it. But we came to that, and all of a sudden they figured out that if you put a little bend in the hook, a little Z bend or an offset, we had offset hooks, and those you could actually keep the worm from sliding down. Well, once they got into that, the extra wide gap or EWG hooks came out. And these great big ones, these, like the name implies, has a great big gap. And with mono and stuff, they worked out well. And then once we got fluorocarbon and braid, as long as you don't snap set, if you do more of the old man, just a dead pull, once you hook a fish on one of these, they would never come off. I mean, they had them buttoned up. And the extra wide gap hook all of a sudden spawned kind of this revolution. And with jigs and stuff, I remember at Lake Fork where it was like a contest to see who could have the biggest gap, the biggest size hook. The gap in the hook, so size, 1/0, 2/0, 3/0, 4/0, they just keep on getting longer. The gap is from the bottom of the hook up to the top. That distance right there, that's the gap. And this is a small gap hook. You can see there's not much room between the hook point and the shaft of the hook. And this one has a big gap. This is like an inch, a width of my finger or so. And this one's maybe like a 1/2 inch gap. So all of a sudden they started going to like 7/0 hooks and jigs, like twice as big as this hook. And they also, they made the gap just astronomical. It was this idea that if you make the gap really big, then that's gonna hook fish better. And yeah, to a certain degree, like if you have a spinnerbait, a slobber knocker, these bladed jigs and stuff, the longer the hook, instead of having to use a trailer hook, if you have a real long one, then yeah, those short strikes, it's gonna get them. But the gap really doesn't make a difference. You can thread on a trailer really thin, and the gap, like I said, it's not that important. And actually the gap, it costs you. And let's get into the gap and how having too big of a gap or the wrong gap actually loses you fish. So a lot of those great big hooks, that was like in the 90s. And then in the 2000s, it seemed like the Japanese pros were the first ones to change. With all the Bubbas and stuff, all the guys in Texas and power fishermen, it was basically the idea was use the biggest hook possible whenever you could get away with it. So that, with jigs and stuff, you go with a big hook. Same with extra wide gap. We're putting these huge hooks in little worms, and it was cartoonish, thinking that, man, if I have enough hook in there, he can't grab the bait without missing it. And then you have a bait that looks like this small bait with this giant hook. And that was literally the concept. It's like, I'm going to put that hook all the way to the tail and they can't miss it. The other thing is it overpowers the bait. So you see this little finesse worm here. When you have this great big hook, you put a 5/0 in it, the action goes away, it stands out. I mean, you have a small bait, and yeah, it's more subtle, but you have this great big hook, so the action's not as good. It kind of wants to, just fall goofy. It totally overpowers it. So the Japanese pros that were fishing in the States at the time, their movement was, instead of trying to use the biggest hook possible, they tried to use the smallest hook possible. And you can see this is basically, it's not that revolutionary. It's what we were using back in the day, back in the 80s, before the early 90s. And you see with this small hook right here, this bait just looks better. It just pairs up better. It's going to work better. It's plenty of hook. So people have kind of figured out this shorter length hook, but they really haven't figured out the gap and how that affects it. And let's talk about those two factors here. We'll get into the first one with keeping fish hooked up and penetrating, and then the second one that really a lot of people still aren't on, trying to get fish out of the cover. We'll get into that one. So the first concept with the hooks here is the gap. Like I said, this one's about a 1/2 inch gap. This one's about 1 inch. They're about the same length. You can see these hooks. They're almost the same length. They're both, say, 2 to 3 inches, but the gap is much bigger on this one. These are both 3/0 hooks, so they're both like, well, they're the same length. They're 3/0. Here's the difference. It's all about leverage. With this bigger gap, you get more force. This gap right here, when a fish is hooked up on the top, he can pry this, and you can see this hook is kind of springy. It's able to open it up more. The difference is when this gap is small, they get less leverage. It's about the same wire hook. This smaller gap, it's really hard to open this one. It takes a lot more force. The bigger the gap, the more leverage they get. So to get the same stiffness, you're going to have to go to a bigger wire hook with a bigger gap to keep that that spring out of it. And why does that matter? So for two things, when you're trying to drive that hook point through the fish's mouth, if that hook is springing a little bit, if it's giving, if it's flexing, it's not going to drive through. It's going to scrape across the top of the mouth instead of punch through it. So the springiness, that leads to less hookups. The second thing, that spring, when you have hooks that'll give and stuff, when fish jump off and stuff, a lot of times it's those springier hooks. The stiffer the hook, the less they'll jump off. So you can either go to a great big thick wire one. The problem is that thick wire, it's harder, it takes a bigger hole, it's harder to drive that through the fish's mouth. A real tiny thin wire one goes through better. So the best of both worlds is trying to keep a smaller diameter wire on your hook, but then go to that small gap. And if you think about it, you know, these tiny hooks we're using on jig head minnows and all the, you know, drop shot hooks and stuff, they're tiny little hooks. Normally you don't open them up, and yeah, you're using spinning rods and stuff and you turn down the drag, but still you're using braid. There's not much stretch in there, and they don't open up even on big fish because it's a tiny little gap. They can't get a lot of leverage to open it up. Unless you just hork down that drag, it keeps them hooked up well. So principle one, going with that smaller gap when you can. Now if you have a great big, you know, 12-inch worm that's an inch in diameter, yeah, you have to go to a bigger gap. But when you go to that smaller gap hook, it's just harder to open up. It's going to drive through the roof of their mouth better without flexing, and when they come up and jump and shake their head and all that stuff, it's not going to flex. It's going to stay hooked up better. So now this second part, this is about losing fish and getting them out of cover. And I don't think many people are onto this, but I think it makes a huge difference. When you're fishing heavy flooded cover, or you punch it into grass and lily pads around docks and stuff, how many times do you catch a hook a fish, move him about 3 to 10 feet, then all of a sudden, boom, he gets snagged up and then you can't get him out. Sometimes he comes out, but usually you end up losing that fish. You know, that great big one, you'd had him coming, or there's just one tree or one clump of weed or something, you bring him to the boat, you think you have him, and all of a sudden he dives into that cover and he's hung up and I can't get him, he comes off. Happens a lot, right? Happens all the time. So obviously that's a problem. Even in open water, they find that one piece of cover, and when you're flipping flooded crazy stuff like this, flooded bushes and lily pads and stuff, half the time, I mean, you set the hook and you move him a foot and then he's hung up and you can't get him out. Well, bigger hooks are a lot of times part of the problem. And it's pretty simple. With that small gap and a small hook, guess what? The big ones, when you hook them, a lot of times it's hanging out, the hook point's hanging out the side of their mouth. The bigger the hook, when I'm reeling him in, there's this big hook point sticking out that's catching every limb, and it's catching every lily pad stem and every piece of grass on the way out. With that tiny little hook, how many times you have to take pliers or something, it's kind of pinned, it's not sticking out far, it's barely sticking outside of his mouth, or it's tight up against that lip. It went up and through and it's just laying on the skin there. You reel them out. How many times with wacky worms and drop shots and stuff, those tiny hooks, if you pitch into boat docks and you throw into brush piles and stuff, if you don't hang up originally, when you hook a fish, you can lead him out of there. You just keep tension and magically he just swims out. You know why? Because this great big hook isn't hanging out there and snagging everything that it goes by, right? It's the small hook. The beauty of the small hook is that, like I said, it doesn't flex, but the big thing, anytime you're fishing cover, that thing is not sticking out here to hang you up. And like I said, they always go for that cover, or you're trying to bring them out of just a mess of cover. Going with that smaller hook, I think, is going to work out for you with less flex. It's going to drive through the mouth better, but especially when you're trying to get them out of the cover, it's not going to grab something and lose that big one halfway back to the boat.